Hello, everyone. So one of the reasons we're here is to talk about some of the dark themes in young adult literature. So you both deal with dark themes in your books. What are some of those themes that you deal with?
Well, we could just do like a laundry list. So there's homelessness, suicide, eating disorders, addiction, self-harm, rampant depression. What do you have, Jenny?
I think that about covers it for me too. I had, in my first book, I had mental health issues, family dysfunction, eating disorder. And then the second one, it was suicide and depression. And this one, verbal and physical abuse, cyclical abuse through generations.
Right.
And yeah, I think.
Okay. And so there are lots of common misconceptions about young adult literature, which we're going to sort of cover as we go on. But what subjects are off limits in young adult literature? Because I've had countless experiences with even YA authors telling me that there is a line. So what exactly is that line? What's allowed?
I don't think that there's anything that's really, at least not for me, that's, hands off. I think that YA literature is like any other category of literature. You have all kinds of things out there. And I don't really think that anything's hands off. I will say that as a young adult author, I think that there are certain ways that you may want to present things to your audience, or you may want to be sensitive about, but certainly you have to be honest and realistic, because you don't want your reader to think that you're BSing them. You want to be truthful with them, even if that is a difficult truth, and even if that is really raw. But I don't think anything's off limits.
I don't think that anything is off limits. I have a lot of opinions about that subject. We read the Hunger Games, and that's kids killing kids. But no one ever really wants to pull that off the shelf. And I love that book as much as anyone else, because that's a good book. I mean, that's a good story. I think that the one thing that, if you're going to write stories that plumb the depths of difficult subjects, which should not be off limits, because that's life. And a lot of teenagers have that life, and they should be able to read about that life. You can't sugarcoat it. I mean, suicide is the #1 cause of death among teenagers. So if you don't have a book like 13 Reasons Why or All the Right Places on your shelf in school, or let your kids read it, I think that's a disservice to them, because they've either thought about it, or they know someone who's thought about it, or they know someone who's done it. But I think that the responsibility of the author who is writing mainly for a young adult audience is to have hope at the end of that book. And I don't care if it's like a sliver of light through a crack in a door, or ripped blind, or if you open that door wide and you give them everything that that character has deserved all throughout the book. You must have hope. And that's the difference. You can write a book for adults, and you can have as bleak an ending as you want, because we're adults and we know all these truths now, and we're like, ugh. But when you're a teenager, you need that sliver of hope. Like Jenny said in her opening remarks, you need to think that some things are going to get better, and it is true that some things are. And some things you're just going to learn to live with, but you have to have hope, and that's your responsibility. And if you read a book that has very difficult subjects in it, that is marketed to teenagers, and it doesn't have hope, then you can put that book back and complain about it, because it should have some reason for that reader to go on.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there has to be something for the reader, something for that young adult, and to see, okay, these are issues and problems that may not be easy to get through, that are really raw and that are really difficult, but that I do see this sliver of hope at the end. And that doesn't mean it has to have this like fantastic, wonderful, happy ending with a bow tied at the end or anything like that. But there should be a sense that there's a way to go on.
Right.
Yeah.
And one thing that I love, if you haven't read Jenny's book, Because of the Sun, which happens very early on, this girl has lost her mother in a horrible way. And one of the great conflicts that Jenny has in this book is, her mother didn't treat her very nicely. And now she's dead. And so that's really hard. She's gone, and you loved her, but you didn't. And so Danny could go either way with this. She's like stuck in this tremendous grief, which has traumatized her, almost to the point of being catatonic. And the thing that I loved, the turn in the book there in the first 30 pages, was that she finds a book. And she's going to read it.
She does.
And that book sustains her until she can find her footing. And that's what books do, is they can help you. They can help you feel those feelings that you can't articulate safely.
Right.
Just by reading. And I think that that's really the most important thing about having the books with like subjects like ours on the shelf.
But it doesn't have to be rainbows and ponies and that kind of ending.
I like rainbows and ponies.
Me too. But one of the things that I hear a lot is when I tell people I write young adult literature or fiction, they say, "Oh, you write for children," as if it's something that's lesser. So, young adult can't be, in their eyes, young adult can't be beautiful and poetic and literary. Is there such a thing as literary YA?
Okay, well, first I just want to say that those people who are they think that young adult novels are somehow lesser, what does that mean? What is their opinion of actual teenagers then?
Right.
What kind
Exactly.
of dismissive comment is that? You should let kids read whatever they want. If you tell them that's not a good book, don't read that. Let them read whatever they want. You've just told them that what they like is wrong, and that's not good.
Right. Yeah, and I think it is. It is very dismissive of teenagers because teenagers can handle all kinds of things and a lot more than adults think they can,
Right.
and they're often underestimated. And so it's not really surprising that the literature that they read is underestimated as well. But I think that there are all kinds of things in YA literature. Are there light, fluffy type of books? Sure, like any other category of literature out there. Are there thrillers? Are there romances? Are there mysteries?
Yeah.
Are there all kinds of stuff?
There's a whole rom-com genre that's
Right.
really great.
Exactly. And I think, like adults, teens have different tastes and they're going to gravitate to different things.
Right.
There are books that aren't written as well, right, in adult literature, just
Right.
as there are, right, in
Oh,
young
yeah.
adult
Yeah,
literature. So.
absolutely. But that to say that a teenager can't appreciate a book that is deals with a little bit heavier things or realities of life or that is poetic is pretty heartbreaking because teenagers, they're intelligent individuals who can handle and read all kinds of things. So.
I know. I mean, what is your high school reading list? Still, like The Grapes of Wrath. That's not exactly a walk in the park.
Right.
I mean, and when you think about that book, and I love that book, and I like John Steinbeck, and but also, why are you not assigning books to adolescents that are actually about the adolescent experience while they're an adolescent in the classroom? Can't it be a mix? Can't you mix that list up? Can't it be more diverse in terms of experience and culture? I mean,
Well,
they're still reading like the same canon for the most
Same, yeah.
part.
I do think that teachers run into sometimes a brick wall for
Right.
that kind of stuff, which is a little sad, and the amount of time that they have to go in depth about the other literature that they'd like to introduce students. Sometimes they have their hands tied, but it's out there, and I'm glad that it's out there for students, and,
Right.
and it's usually English teachers who are, kind of
Working on it.
yes,
Yeah.
guiding them to those books and putting those books in their hand.
I saw an article the other day about how, reading lists, they don't want teens and middle graders to read graphic novels because they're not considering those novels. I'm like, they are. And
They
that they,
are.
that they wouldn't be able to learn how to visualize things on their own. And I disagree with that because if you read graphic novels, they're totally immersive. they're a series. They're like gorgeous, and I think they're great for kids to read. Anything that gets kids reading and talking about stuff, I think, is a great tool in the classroom.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So something else to note is that both of your books deal particularly with the heavy topic of pain. Both of your characters sort of struggle with this internal pain. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how they sort of balance that and sort of overcome it?
Okay.
Oh, I'll let you go first.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. So Danny is dealing with the grief of her mother dying and the conflicting emotions that she has about loving this person and hating this person deeply. So she deals with her pain by trying not to feel it and trying to ignore it and trying to push it down, which I think that a lot of teens do. When I was a teenager, I was angsty and I looked angry and I looked sad, but I wasn't talking a whole lot about what was going on in my life, and my friends and I were talking about, hey, can't wait to get out of this hell place. I can't wait to go and really live my life. And they were all dealing with their own issues as well, but we weren't talking about all those things. We were just kind of pushing it down, and it was kind of later that I really realized the extent of what some of my friends were living through. So that's kind of how Danny is. She's just kind of trying to not feel that stuff and trying to stay numb, and she tries to do it by walking, taking these long walks and burning her memories away of her mother. But she does overcome that stuff, or she is able to begin to explore the healing process of all that because she has some kind people around her and because she does have some supportive people around her. Mostly, she's kind of trying to deal with it on her own, maybe not in the best of ways, but she's trying to deal with it on her own. And nobody comes to save her, because ultimately I do feel like teenagers often have to kind of save themselves. But she does have some support around her and people that she ultimately trusts.
One of the similarities between my book and Jenny's is that they have kids in them who are going through really tough lives and a lot of trauma, and they don't have money for therapy. Not a lot of kids do, right. And I think that's really important. I like reading books I really like books that take place in rehab centers or recovery centers and hospitals in general, because I like that dynamic. But that's not the real case for a lot of kids now and adults because of the medical system. A lot of people don't have insurance, and Charlie gets kicked out of that hospital and is she goes to Tucson on a bus, and she's by herself. You have to work on it yourself. In the end, it's really you who's going to help you get past things or learn how to deal things or heal. And like Danny, Charlie has been physically abused by her mother for her entire life. And when you have that on a daily basis, you start to shut down. You start to not be able to feel, because to feel means that you could become a target, that somebody might notice you. But your body wants you to feel. But part of your brain has been so messed up by being abused that you don't know how to deal with intense emotion. Like if you get angry, then your mom's probably going to get angry at you, so you can't show it. And if you get angry at school, they're going to kick you out or you're going to get in trouble. And so sometimes the only way that you can get past those intense feelings of alienation or pain, strangely, is to hurt yourself, which is exactly what Danny does when she's walking in the desert and literally trying to burn herself, to burn her feelings away. And Charlie does it by harming herself. And the strange physiological fact of that is that when you do those things to yourself, you create endorphins, which make you feel better. But then you're stuck, because then, like Charlie says, you have these scars, and you're weird, and you're a freak, and people stare at you, and then you feel bad, and then it's like a vicious cycle that never stops. And what that is also addiction, and that's the way that alcohol works as well. Once it gets in your body and it finds a place to root, it can stay there. So
I think we can take some audience questions. Anybody have a question? Lots of people.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
First of all, I want to thank you because I recently turned 18 and it is thank you. And it is really important for us teenagers to have these kind of books on the shelves. Second of all, I believe you both publish your books traditionally, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I am an aspiring writer. How did this whole publishing method and process was for both of you?
So, like I said, I didn't want to write this book, and I wrote 3 other books that are just sitting there that I never tried to send out. And then I wrote this one, and it took me 9 years because in the space of that time, and I like to tell this story because I want people to know that however long it takes. And you have to forgive yourself because life happens. So I was writing this book, and then my sister died, and she died 5 days after I gave birth to my son, which was another huge life event. And then my mother died. And so I didn't write. There were times when I didn't write for like a year or 2 years because I couldn't. But that was always the story that I was thinking about and writing in my head, even if I wasn't writing it on paper. And in the beginning of the story, when I first began, Charlie was out of the hospital. She was okay. She was trying to make a life. Riley's name was Ike. He was 47 years old. She had a friend named Michelle. There was no Ellis. And she had a twin named Seth. And gradually, this is the revision part. I went through 13 drafts before I sent it out. And the revision part is right after my mother died and I couldn't write for a year and I was thinking about her and all of these things, and I realized I needed to make Charlie Davis as alone as possible. She needed to be alone because that's what the readers who needed her felt like, that they didn't have any parents, or the ones that they had weren't good people, or that they had no friends, or the ones that they had caused them pain. And so I had to strip all of that away because at that moment, I was a motherless girl and I was going to write a motherless girl who was completely alone in the world. And then the technical side of it is you find an agent, you look them up, you look at the acknowledgments in somebody else's book and you see who their agent is. If you're like, I like that book, maybe that agent would like my book. And you query them. And you send them like 20 pages over email and a nice letter that's a synopsis of the book, which is a really good way for you to think about how would I write the jacket copy for my own book. Like that's what they want to know, the hook. And for me in particular, I went to a writer's conference and I signed up for the query meeting with an agent. And that's how I met my first agent, which was a really good experience for me. In the long run, I eventually parted ways with her and I got another agent who sold the book. But there are lots of different ways to like put yourself in that atmosphere in front of an agent who can read the work and tell you what's going on and might show some interest. And I would not like turn down your nose at self-publishing either, because I know quite a few people who self-published and then an agent picked them up and now they're published traditionally. But self-publishing has its perks too, because you control everything and you can keep all the money for yourself and you can get published quicker, because traditional publishing takes probably like 2 years. I would
really
say,
long
for
time,
each
yeah.
book, yeah.
From when like a agent acquires it and you go through revisions with an agent, and then they go on submission, which is where they send it around to editors and houses, and then an editor acquires it, and then there's revisions with the editor. It takes a really really long time.
Oh my God, no one talks about that.
Oh,
like when you sell your book and you're like,
it's the worst.
They love it, it's so great, and you're like, this is really great. And then like 4 months later, your editor sends you like a 25-page
Yes.
single-spaced letter saying, okay.
I love it. Here are all the things we're going to change.
So you're going to cut like 30 pages here.
Yeah.
And like take out these 3, and then you're like, what?
Right. I thought you loved it. I thought you
And they're
loved
like,
me.
I do.
Yeah. Yes. So it's a lot of work, and it's a really, really long process. It's worth it. It's wonderful. One of the things that I used to do when I didn't have an agent and I didn't have an editor is I would You guys are gonna laugh at me. I would go to Barnes and Noble, and I would go to the shelf where my book would be.
I do
if
that. I still
were-
do that.
Yeah.
I'm like, where's John Green's book? I want it right next to me.
Well, mine was next to Alex mine would be next to Alex Sanchez. So I remember looking at the shelf and just kind of like touching his book and being like, mine will be next to you. So,
That's currently my life.
yeah. So, like Kathleen said, I think there are different ways that you can get your work out there. But the most important thing is to keep working at it, no matter how long it takes, no matter the circumstances, because a lot of publishing is just persistence and, keeping at it.
And that, whatever story you're writing, somebody needs to read it.
Yeah.
And they're waiting for you to finish it and send it out somewhere through whatever avenue so they can read it. And then you'll start getting like letters from them. And that is like the best part of having published a book to me.
It is
that I get these letters and people share their stories with you. And you're like, oh, thank you. Thank you. It's so great. And you feel like everything that you've done has been validated. Also, they'll probably change your title.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
They do.
Yeah.
They do.
And they'll make it seem like you have a choice.
And
They're
but
like,
you
what do you think
don't.
of these 5? And you're like, well, and they're like, oh, this one's great. Bye. And it's the
Yeah.
same. It's
And
the same thing with the cover
Your
too.
cover. I was just gonna say your cover is like, what do you think? Well, that's what we're going with. So,
Yeah.
Okay.
And you could even, your agent will probably be like, oh, sure, I'll say that you don't like and try to fight for you. But really, they know
No,
the whole thing too
they
because
know.
they're in the business.
Right.
And then you're like, oh, I see. It was really never a choice after all.
Yeah. But I think the when it's really yours is when you're creating it. That's when it's all yours. Once it starts hitting agents, editors, art department, all that, readers, that the story's not yours anymore. So.
Which is good in its way too.
Yeah,
It's
it
kind
is.
of nice.
Yeah.
So kind of piggybacking onto that question a little bit then in your editing process, did either of you have any characters or scenes or themes or anything like that you really had to like go to bat for that maybe an editor did want to cut or they thought might be too intense for YA or something where you had to kind of say, no, this is important and this needs to be there?
I'm going to say like our books.
I think they knew
took
what they
our
were getting
yeah,
into with
like
us.
they knew, and I would say Random House like really championed our books to take them with like that subject matter, which we really, I think this is good. We really wrote the hell out of some painful stuff,
Right.
And my editor never asked me to cut any of the more triggering scenes or anything like that. I mean, the things that she asked me to change were actually like strangely innocuous things. Like I had to take out nipples because she thought that would be too, as she said, titillating, which I think is funny. But then like, there are these intense scenes of like emotional upheaval and like self-harm, and she's like, let's take out nipples.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important to, be paired up with the right editor who's going to go to bat for your book because, I feel lucky too that I wasn't asked to take anything out or soften anything or censor anything. But, I think when editors kind of come across a manuscript that is just dealing with those kinds of heavy issues, they know what they're getting into and they kind of love it. And
They do.
Yeah.
They really, you find the right editor and they know what kind of writer you are.
Right.
And if you try to kind of veer away from that, sometimes they'll be like, no, go back.
Right.
So, but I have known other writers who, their editors like cut their book in half, even after they said they loved it because they do love it. But they're like,
That's true.
I want you to get rid of 100 pages.
Or get rid of this whole character
and
just, make it different. Yeah. Heard of the same.
I kept trying to make Riley like more nuanced as a character, and my editor finally just said, no, he's bad, Kathleen. He's just bad. You're going to take out these 25 pages. He's bad. He is bad. He's bad. Don't make him nice. He's bad. And finally I was like, okay.
Hi. So in both of your books, your characters start out in Florida and St. Paul, and they both end up in the desert where they're going through all this pain. And I just wondered what the significance, or if there is a significance to the desert as a setting for that part of the story, and what that significance is to you ladies.
So yes, I think for Danny it is pretty significant because she, she feels a bit hopeless at the beginning and confused, and it's very reflective of how Danny feels. And and I was telling Kathleen this earlier, so I've pretty much been on the East Coast my whole life. I lived in New York and then I lived in Florida, and I'd never been out Southwest at all. But my husband's parents live there, and so the first time I went out to New Mexico was about 15 years ago. We went out for his uncle's funeral, and I remember going out there and being like, this place is horrible. Like, it is just bare and stark, and it's just brown dirt everywhere, like not a tree in sight. And I'm just thinking, I don't understand why anybody would live here, and I don't understand why anybody would move here, and I just don't get it. So, that's what I was thinking when I got there and when we landed. And then after being there a couple of days, I was like, this place is fantastic. It's beautiful. It's enchanting. It's got its own kind of beauty. And I think that really runs parallel to Danny and how her life was really she felt it was horrible, and her relationship with her mother was horrible, and everything that she kind of lived through was horrible. But, then she kind of comes out of it, or is able to deal with it. And there is this beauty that she sees in herself and in her life, and even in her mother, which is really hard for her to kind of admit. But once she understands her mother, she can kind of see it all in a big picture kind of way. So I would say the setting, when I went to New Mexico, I was like, someday I'm gonna write a book that is set here, because it was pretty impressive to me. So
I grew up in the Southwest. I lived in Pennsylvania until I was 11, and then I moved to Arizona, and I lived in New Mexico for a long time. And I felt like I wanted Charlie to move because I physically wanted her to have to be stripped bare. And in Minnesota, she could hide 8 months of the year under heavy clothing and long sleeves, and you can't do that in the Southwest. And I wanted her to have to strip all of that, the protections that she might have had, away, so that she could really address herself and some of her issues and move forward and accept her failings as well. And also, we were talking about this earlier, if you're in the Southwest, there's like this something comes over you after a while where things just start to fall away. And I know that sounds like cliched and stuff, but it's true. Like, there's a reason that New Mexico is called the land of enchantment because it does. And you're there for a little while, and suddenly you're like, I could just wear overalls for the rest of my life and live in a one-room adobe with a lawn chair and a dog, and I don't need cable, and I don't need any of this. I just need to look at the sky. And it is like a totally true, it's just a true thing. And I really wanted to put Charlie in that book. And also, I don't think enough books, particularly for young adults, are set in the Southwest. They're always like in nameless Midwestern areas or like a big city. And I think it's important to have them like in these other locales.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. So if I could, I saw your hand up here.
Is there anything besides your personal experience or experience that you saw through students that inspired you to write these two books?
Through my students? Anything specific, you mean? Yeah. No, not anything specific. I wouldn't want to take a student's life and
No.
Make it into something else or what they're going through or their pain. What inspired me in general was their resilience and just knowing that they were kind of going on even with the kinds of difficult situations that they were living through, or having to deal with. So there's nothing specific in general, just the experience of being a teenager and living those teenage years and how awkward and strange and weird and thrilling and exciting they can be at the same time, because you know, Danny goes through some pretty thrilling things as well, even within all this kind of pain that she's dealing with. She meets this guy and he's wonderful, and you know, she connects with him and all kinds of things. So I think just remembering my own teenage experience and in general admiring my students and kind of like the cool kind of kids that they were and what they were able to get through was what I used mostly as inspiration, but nothing very specific.
I don't have any students. I did teach for a little while, but you would never take like your students' stories or anything. Right. And mostly, when I was writing it, I just tried to think about who I was writing for and how I felt when I was like between 13 and 18, which is a really raw and yet like light-filled time. That's part of the reasons that things are so painful, is because you're feeling things to like the maximum degree, whether they're good or bad. And I just tried to retain that feeling of what it was like to be that age. And you know, I read young adult books as a 15-year-old kid. I don't read them as a redacted year-old woman. I read them as a teenager, and I think a lot of adults, when they're reading young adult books, get upset about them because they're not reading them as though they were 15 again. They're reading them as though they're a 40-year-old person. And they're like, oh God, I don't want my child to read this, because they don't want to remember what it was like. Mm-hmm. And if they just like took off that veil and read it as the teenager, man, they'd really like the story, because the young adult has some really great plots. I have to tell you, some good plots. But then they would remember what it felt like, and it might help them when they were thinking about what kids should read or what their kids should read and why.